would like to say thank you to our co-sponsors of the lecture series, Historic Albuquerque, Inc. and Oasis. And also a big thank you to our friends of the Public Library, who is this year celebrating their 50th anniversary, our Library Foundation and our Library Advisory Board, and all those people who advocate for us. We appreciate all of you all. But today you're here to talk about this mini sub that traveled through Albuquerque, and let me introduce our speakers to you. Dick Brown is a retired engineer, an award-winning author, and a Cold War submarine veteran. He's been fascinated by submarines all his life. He led a successful statewide grassroots initiative to convince the Navy to name a nuclear sub after our state. So the USS New Mexico was commissioned into the fleet in March 2010. When he saw a photo of the Japanese midget sub that they'll be discussing today in Albuquerque Museum's Route 66 exhibit in May 2016, he started researching the story behind this little sub cruising down Central Avenue. Our second presenter, Roland Patilla, is a retired civil engineer who moved to New Mexico in 1998 from California. He was here to work on the New Mexico 44 highway project, and he planned to finish that project and then move back to California in a few years. But as fate would have it, he met Peggy, whom he married in 2003, and has lived in the land of entrapment for 20 years. And I understand that because I am a new resident to the land of entrapment. I love it here. After retirement in 2012, he became interested in Albuquerque's history and is now a member of two of our major organizations that study the history of Albuquerque. He is one of a group of volunteers who gives the free walking tours downtown, and he's a docent at the Albuquerque Museum for Old Town Tours. So please help me welcome our presenters, Dick Brown and Roland.
Okay, can you hear me okay? Okay, I'm going to talk about a midget submarine that was part of the attack of Pearl Harbor in December 1941. This submarine actually went right by that door right over there in 1943. For starter, I'm going to give you some background on why it was here, and then I'll give you the backstory on how it was captured and brought to the U.S. and put to good use. This happens to be the 76th anniversary of the Treasury Department's War Bonds program to raise money for the war effort. And the war prize that we had was used in parades and exhibits nationwide. And so after it toured California and Arizona, it came by New Mexico and made a tour through the state, visiting 12 communities in 12 days. This was January 1943. So the war bonds came in different denominations, anywhere from $25 up to $10,000. And they had a maturity of 10 years at 2.9 rate of return. So the submarine was used throughout the country to raise money for the war effort. This is, I'm going to use the term HA-19 quite a bit. This is the Japanese designation for this particular midget submarine hull. It's like a hull number. I'll tell you how it got here in a little bit, but it spent the night at Kirtland Base. At the time it was like an Army air base, and they called it Kirtland Field. And members out there on the base were given an opportunity to take a look at this submarine. But that's what it looked like. That's a nice artist representation of it. Now, to get from Kirtland to downtown, it had to get under the Santa Fe underpass. The Santa Fe Railroad has a bridge over Central. And you see the conning tower, the top of the highest part of the submarine. From there down to the pavement is about 15 feet. But the clearance under that underpass was 13 feet. So what they did, they had a winch on this large flatbed, and they could actually rotate the submarine about 45 degrees to get that sail lower so they could get under some low clearances. So that was important. Now, these pictures were actually taken in Ann Arbor, Michigan, so you can't relate those to Albuquerque. But you can relate this one to Albuquerque. The submarine, after going under the underpass and getting made vertical again, she looked like this. She's going west on Central Avenue on January 14th. We had 20,000 spectators lining Central Avenue, and it, at the time, was the biggest parade in the city's history. That big rig and the submarine together are about 90 feet long, so this is quite an operation going right downtown. What it did is it turned around at 8th Street. There was no roundabout there now like it is today, but somehow she got turned around and then stopped for a static display between 4th and 5th Streets. The city purchased a $10,000 bond, so that was part of the contribution to the war effort. KOB Radio did a remote broadcast during that display. So that picture is such a great picture. I want to show it to you a little bit bigger. It's in front of the Armeo building, and it was taken by Chester Bever, an optometrist, from his second floor office in the Barnett building across the street. So this is the picture that got me started researching on this. That picture was part of the Route 66 display. I think it was May 2016 at the Albuquerque Museum. So that got my attention. Being a submariner, I wanted to know, what is that all about? And how did it get here? The parade was actually a joint military and civilian operation. We had a couple colonels from Kirtland base, and also Clyde Tingley, the chairman at the time of the Albuquerque City Commission. Part of the parade included UNM's Naval Reserve Officer Training Corps, the 31st Army Air Force Band, and several women's organizations, the American Legion, veterans of World War I, and Albuquerque High School Band, all moving west down Central from Broadway to 8th Street. Okay, here's how we got our hands on this submarine. On December 6, 1941, there were 5 large Japanese submarines with a midget submarine riding piggyback behind the sail. These midgets were going to be deployed as part of the attack on Pearl Harbor. The one I'm going to talk about is HA-19, and she was, I'm going to find the little arrow here. This is HA-19. She was riding on the back of I-24. This is the commanding officer, Kuseo Sakamaki, and his crew member here was Inagaki. It was a 2-man midget submarine, that's all it would hold, and their mothership was I-25. So the plan was for these 5 submarines to lay off Pearl Harbor about 30 miles offshore, and at midnight, this is an artist rendering of I-24 with HA-19 on board. I-24 surfaced about 30 miles off Oahu, and you can see Inagaki and Sakamaki climbing aboard. They have to go to the very top of the conning tower and crawl through a 16-inch hatch. Fortunately, the Japanese were smaller and they fit through. Then there's crew members on board. Oops, I went too fast. Hard to see in the dark. I wanted to show you this pointer. There's other crew members on board. After these two got on board the midget sub, they detached this submarine, and I-24 submerged, and HA-19 floated off and went on her mission. That mission did not go very well. All 5 midget submarines tried to get into Pearl Harbor, but they were discovered because they had trouble finding the channel, the dredged channel into Pearl. And they were discovered, and this is the destroyer Ward that shelled and dropped depth charges. The Ward actually sunk HA-20, one of the 5 subs, and damaged HA-19. When HA-19 deployed, she already knew she had a bad gyro compass, and that gave her all kinds of fits for navigation, and that's why she ran aground on a reef just outside of Pearl Harbor. A little bit more about what this submarine looks like. It's strictly an electric submarine. It has a big 600 horse motor and 2 battery banks and 2 propellers in the stern rotating counterclockwise to each other. In the bow, there are 2 torpedoes with big warheads. There was also a 300-pound scuttling charge. These were suicide submarines, and after they fired their torpedoes, they were probably going to scuttle the sub because they probably could not get out of there once they were discovered firing torpedoes inside Pearl Harbor. The plan was to enter Pearl Harbor during the lull between the 2 aerial attacks from the Japanese carriers. And what they were looking for is our carriers and our battleships and our cruisers. Fortunately, all our carriers were at sea, but our battleships and our cruisers took a beating. This is another picture of HA-19 in a torpedo. It's an 800-pound warhead, and it can go about 3 or 4 miles at 50 miles an hour. The submarine itself can travel about 26 miles an hour, submerged a little slower, and only had a range of about 100 miles. And she could only go about 100 feet deep. Pearl Harbor was about 40 feet deep, so that was going to work. Well, here's the demise of the 5 midgets. HA-16 was sunk in the West Lock, so it did get into Pearl, but it didn't get to do anything except get sunk. HA-22 fired both torpedoes, but missed a destroyer, and that destroyer turned right around and rammed and sunk HA-22. So the 2 that got in got essentially killed. But 3 did not get in. HA-20, I told you already, the Ward sunk her. So she's gone. HA-18 was sunk off Kihei Lagoon. It's the present-day location of the Honolulu airport, and it's a site where Hawaii Five-0 and Magnum PI had a lot of film shot there. It was discovered in 1960 and recovered, and now is on display at the Japanese Naval Academy. Now, HA-19 was fired on by the Helm, another destroyer, but the destroyer missed. However, she got snagged on that reef several times. Depth charges damaged the torpedo firing mechanism. She was in a lot of trouble, but she did escape. Unfortunately, the crew were overcome by battery fumes, chlorine, and passed out. And the submarine drifted. And you can see the path. It drifted past Diamond Head and around Cocoa Head and to the far east corner of Oahu and hit another reef just off Waimanalo. Well, she was discovered, of course, and Sakamaki tried to set the demolition charge, but it failed. They both jumped overboard. Inagaki drowned in the surf, but Sakamaki made it to shore. And they were discovered, and the submarine had a line towed to it. She's essentially captured. Sakamaki is captured by some troops from the Army's Bellows Field just north of Waimanalo. This picture shows Navy and Army, but it's really, I think Roland will clarify this, but it was really some, I think, National Guard troops from Bellows Field. But we captured the submarine, and not only that, we captured Sakamaki, the very first POW in World War II in the Pacific Theater. I'm a submarine stamp collector, and I wanted to show you that Kiana had a stamp showing the actual, you can see the picture behind the stamp. This is the same picture. And also a picture of the ward. And the subscript says, sinks two midget submarines. It sank HA-20, but not HA-19 because she's captured. Okay, we salvaged HA-19 as a war prize, and we shipped it to the mainland on the deck of a freighter. And this was right after Pearl Harbor, January 1942. She arrived at Mare Island Naval Shipyard in Vallejo, California. I was actually stationed there in the 60s. And this is a war prize that was going to be used by the Treasury Department in its War Savings Fund campaign, which was a nationwide tour. And this submarine, the one that passed right by those doors out there, ended up being the star attraction in many parades and exhibits throughout the country. Whoops. Here you see it on a rail car, and eventually she was put on a flatbed and modified. While she was at the shipyard, FDR had a chance to take a look at the sub. You see him in the back seat of that car and about 3 Secret Service agents standing around. But this is actually on a naval base. This submarine was modified at the shipyard by installing some stairs and a walkway, and 22 viewing windows were cut into the hull so that people that bought war bond savings stamps and bonds could go up that catwalk and take a look inside the submarine. That nationwide tour started in San Francisco, actually on October 27th. It was 1942. It was called Navy Day, and not by FDR, but Teddy Roosevelt established Navy Day on his birthday, October 27th. Well, after touring Northern California, the sub started making its way down the California coast, and here it is in Los Angeles Coliseum. So here we have a submarine that was used as a weapon against us, but we turned around and used it as a financial weapon against Japan. And it became, as I said, the centerpiece for this war bonds campaign. As it toured around the track in Los Angeles Coliseum, I understand that the crowd issued a lot of boos and hisses as it went by. Here's the tour through New Mexico. After touring California and then across Arizona, where it went to Phoenix and Tucson, it came into New Mexico right at Lordsburg, and went to Deming, Las Cruces, went down to El Paso and Fort Bliss for a weekend, then up the Rio Grande Valley to Hatch and Hot Springs, Socorro, Los Lunas, Belen area, Albuquerque, through to Harris Canyon, to Moriarty. It made a stop in Moriarty. And then at Klein's Corners, it caught 285 and went down the Pecos Valley, visiting Roswell, Artesia, Carlsbad, and then entered Texas and headed for Pecos, Texas. So here is more details on that actual tour. In Lordsburg, they collected $1,900. They were actually, the submarine was greeted by a honor guard and 600 school children. Ironically, there was a Japanese-American internment camp at Lordsburg run by the Army, and later they relocated the Japanese Americans and used it as a POW camp for captured German and Italians. It's just ironic. Sakamaki was taken to some POW camps in the U.S., but not this one. But we thought, boy, would that be ironic if his sub actually ended up there. I put a stamp, Deming's going to have a stamp issued for it in another month or so.
It's issued.
Is it out?
Yes.
Okay. Next stop, Las Cruces. And here we had the New Mexico A&M, which is now New Mexico State University ROTC unit, escort the sub downtown. And the city fire department did a real neat thing. They sounded the siren every time a $1,000 bond was sold, and that siren went off 35 times. Las Cruces raised $100,000, and that includes $2,200 from Union High School and $10,000 from Anthony and another $800 from Mesilla. Here you see the sub stopped in Las Cruces, right downtown, and you can see that little catwalk with people taking a look in the submarine. Those windows produced steel cutouts, so 22 steel cutouts were available to purchasers of $10,000 bonds. And the city of Albuquerque bought one of those, but we don't know what happened to it. Another picture of the sub in Las Cruces. And I think this is kind of a cool picture because there's 33 kids with 12 adults posing along the starboard aft section of the midget sub HA-19. And speaking of school kids, here's how the submarine compares in size to a standard school bus. The sub is 81 feet long and 6 feet in diameter and weighs about 46 tons. Before it went on tour, of course, they took the batteries out in the heavy motor. There were no torpedoes on board, of course. So they lightened the load. After Las Cruces, she did go down to El Paso, as I said, for the weekend. And then arrived in Hatch, January 11th. And you can see people peering into those windows right there. Hatch raised $4,300. That's pretty impressive. Hot Springs, which is now Tier C, January 12th, $2,200. I forgot to mention that Governor Dempsey arranged for state police escort for this submarine to tour throughout the state of New Mexico. Here it's visiting Socorro and Belen. That's not actually a picture in those communities, but I wanted just to point out that you see again people lined up to go up the walkway and go peer into the submarine. That arrangement was on both the port and starboard side of the sub. So a 1 hour stop in Belen, 2,000 people took a look, and Belen raised $3,200. Well, after the Albuquerque visit, which I showed you at the beginning of this presentation, I was wondering how is she going to get through to Harris Canyon, because at the time it was just a two-lane highway, and there was a very sharp curve called Dead Man's Curve, which was, I thought, probably a little tricky, but she did make it. She went through on Route 66 and stopped, didn't stop, but went through to Harris and Edgewood, but did stop in a community called Buford, which is now part of Moriarty, but right on Route 66, and you see that picture in the lower right. It's not very good quality, but she's in Buford, Moriarty, New Mexico. But it's really hard to find pictures of the sub in New Mexico, and that's the last one I found. So we found it for Las Cruces, Albuquerque, and Moriarty. That's about it. Well, continuing on Route 66 to 285, and then next stop was Roswell for the weekend. And by the way, the weather forecast at the time she was touring eastern New Mexico was exactly what we're having right now, with cold, windy, and snow squalls. In fact, I live in the East Mountains. We got 2 inches of snow yesterday, but it's melting. Roswell did a lot better than Albuquerque, 213,000. Artesia, almost 100,000. Carlsbad, 77,000. Now, at this point, the tour is headed for Texas and points east, including Dallas and Washington and Chicago. Well, Japan had a whole lot more of these midget submarines that they wanted to use. In fact, they did use them in an attack on Sydney Harbor, Australia, and that was a failure just like Pearl Harbor. But they were prepared to also attack Manila, Singapore, and San Francisco with some of these subs. 84 of them in this picture. By the way, by the end of the war, HA-19 ended up parked at the pier in Chicago, the Navy Pier on Lake Michigan. After that, she ended up going to Key West, and well, like I say, Japan had hundreds of these subs that they wanted to use. Most did not get deployed. In fact, all were destroyed after the Japanese surrendered. So by October 1945, this picture looked like this. We set off demolition charges in that dry dock and destroyed all 84 subs. Well, she made it to Washington. There's a picture of HA-19 at the nation's Capitol building. From there, she went to Key West. It was 1947, and she stayed there until 1990, when the naval station in Key West was closed. But that's how it looked for a number of years in Key West, Florida. Next stop, and this is the final stop, in 1991, she became a part of the permanent exhibit at the Museum of the Pacific War, often called the Nimitz Museum in Fredericksburg, Admiral Nimitz' hometown. And Nimitz himself was a submariner, one of our earliest. And here's what he said about submarines. They're a cross between a Jules Verne fantasy and a humpback whale. Here's how she looks today. Both Roland and I have been to this museum, and it's quite a nice display. The viewing windows were sealed back in, so it looks more like she's ready to go to sea. Closing comments on this. The New Mexico tour added up to $700,000. That's what we contributed to the war effort. In today's dollars, that's about $10 million. The tour passed through 2,000 cities in 41 states. Did not make it to the Northwest. The war was pretty well over by then. And sales, when the submarine was parked for a static display, It averaged making 22,000 per hour while it sat on display. We in fact raised enough money with this tour to finance the repair of all the ships destroyed at Pearl Harbor. Now we're going to switch to Roland, who's looked into the commander of HA-19 in much more detail, Kazuo Sakamaki.
I'm not going to use a mic. Most people say I talk too loudly anyway, so I'm going to use that to my advantage this morning. So, as Dick said, Ensign Kazuo Sakamaki became our prisoner of war #1. Well, that would make him famous in any book. I think his exploits as the skipper of the submarine also qualifies him. He graduated from the Naval Academy at the top of his class at the age of 18. And so he was quite the individual. Most of what I'm going to be telling you today, except for the lies, glad some of you got that, came from the book that he wrote in 1948. The English translation is called I Attacked Pearl Harbor. The original Japanese version of the book was Prisoner of War #1. So he was born on November 18th of 1918, and we share something. I was born on November 19th, so very close. And his parents called him Kazuo, strangely enough, because World War I had just ended, and they named him Peace Boy in the hopes that, war would be over. His father was a school teacher and also ran a small farm. He was the first in his family to enter the military, and his parents were not happy about it. They did not encourage that. So he was accepted into the Naval Academy and was one of only 300 accepted out of those 6,000 applicants. So he already showed some promise just in his application. And here's where he was born and lived until his graduation from high school in something called Shikoku Island, which is in the south part of Japan. So here's a picture of him in his graduation. Edajima Island is Japan's Annapolis. Unfortunately, he and all of the others in his class were taught that victory was the only thing and there was no retreat and to be ready to die. So he graduates in August of 1940. Out of those 300 that were accepted, and after graduation, now he's part of only 23 officers who were assigned to train in this new secret weapon, top secret weapon. And the Japanese was so nervous that someone would find out about this that they actually called these ships targets. So in Japanese, they were called targets. The idea was that they would just be out in the ocean for airplanes to bomb. So they began maneuvers in June of 1941. Remember now, we're talking about Pearl Harbor. I think that's wrong. It's not June of 41, it must be June of 40. Because Pearl Harbor was in December of 41, that's right, so June's correct. So it's 5 to 6 months from Pearl Harbor now, where he's beginning his training. And he completed in September of 41. And part of their training was to memorize the details of all of these harbors for navies or countries that might end up being enemies of Japan. So Hong Kong, Singapore, Sydney, San Francisco, and Pearl Harbor. So imagine any one of those could have been the initial target of the Japanese. Obviously, San Francisco would have been a lot more troublesome due to the extreme distance. So here's their graduation class of the 10 who were chosen out of the 23 to actually man these 5 midget subs. And both Sakamaki and Inagaki are over on the right side there. This picture again was in his book. This is a poster after after Pearl Harbor, when he ended up being captured. The Japanese identified the 9 hero gods and of the ones who had given their lives in the attack against Pearl Harbor. And you'll notice Sakamaki's missing because he was captured and did not die honorably. So there's 9 of them. This is his official POW ID by the Navy when they first captured him on December the 8th. The military hadn't even considered prisoners of war, so they had to use a form that was one of their personnel records to log him into the system. So he was kept in a military brig that was actually for naval members until February of '42. And then at that time they had a ship that was full of both German and internees. These are Japanese Americans who were being sent from Japan to inland on a ship. And everybody knows Executive Order 9066, right? That the President signed to order all Japanese Americans away from the coast.
How could they be sending them from Japan in 1942?
No, they're sending them from Hawaii.
Oh.
These are Japanese Americans who have been living in Hawaii just fine, but many of them born in Hawaii, but because they were obviously ethnic Japanese, they were herded up. They were considered to be a security risk. So he travels by ship to San Francisco and eventually by train across the United States to Camp McCoy. His journey took him across the Rockies through Salt Lake City, Denver, and across the Mississippi to Wisconsin. He watched out the window as the immense size of the United States flew by. He had grown up in Japan, so he was just amazed that he was traveling on this train that took days to go across the country. So he arrives at Camp McCoy, which was an Army base, because there were no POW facilities available. Why does this keep changing? And the snow and pine trees around the camp reminded him of Japan and made him homesick and nostalgic. Since he was so rare, prisoner of war number 1, he was allowed to sleep with the Japanese internees that first night because they hadn't figured out what to do with him. And there were about 30 that came from California, Oregon, Washington, and Nebraska, as well as the ones that traveled with him from Hawaii. And it was the first time that he had met Japanese Americans. And he could speak with some of them in Japanese. And of course, they had nothing in common other than their Japanese faces. So the next day, the camp commander removed him from the internees and gave him a bunk to sleep in over in the corner of the mess hall. The officer in charge of POW operations was named Lieutenant Colonel Horace Rogers, and he came in with an interpreter and asked if there was anything that he needed, and he offered him money, candy, cigarettes, and alcohol. But Sakamaki was still ashamed of being captured and refused any luxuries, only asking for a pencil sharpener, a journal, and some library books in Japanese. On April 9th, he learned of the fall of Bataan. On April 18th, he learned of Captain Doolittle's bold raid on Tokyo, and it worried him that the war was not going well for Japan. He was still loyal to Japan early on, and worried about how his survival would be received should the U.S. win the war. His rigorous Naval Academy training had only taught him an understanding of those with whom he served. However, he had a gradual awakening to the humanness and kindness of the Americans based on how well he was treated by the officers and camp guards. This would eventually lead to his desire to live and to reject his past towards a new life of reason and humanity. And he was surprised at his own personal transformation. He left Camp McCoy in late May of 1942 in a group of 250 other Japanese internees. And they traveled by train through Chicago, Kentucky, and Tennessee to Nashville, where they were transferred to Camp Tularoma. Or to Tularoma Camp Forest, I should say. And by the way, in trying to research this, it's very rare, in fact, it's almost completely difficult to find any wartime pictures of any of these POW camps. There's probably a lot of reasons for that. I mean, if it's a POW camp and you're hanging around with your camera, someone's going to ask you what you're doing. And, you know, it's not something most people would think you'd want to photograph. As a photographer, I photographed a lot of things. People ask me, why are you doing this? So he was temporarily held at Camp Forest, which held both internees and prisoners of war. The internees set up classes, and every day he attended them during the short time he was there. Classes were held on a wide range of topics like English, geography, agriculture, Buddhism, and theology. He recalls seeing a movie for the first time that was provided by the USO, and remembers that the movie star Deanna Durbin, but can't remember the title. I go to movies and can't remember the titles too. His next stop is Camp Livingston. Camp Livingston is in Louisiana. You can see it here in this map. And the work on the barracks was not yet complete when he arrived. There were many civilian internees, including some that had been brought from Central and South America. While ethnically Japanese, they mostly spoke Spanish and didn't have anything in common with the American internees or the Japanese POWs. He states that there were about 1,250 internees at Livingston. Sakamaki slept in a separate hut near the entrance, but the camp commander, Lieutenant Colonel Dan, allowed him to spend his days with the internees. During this time, the Americans treated him with the utmost respect and courtesy, and this continued his transformation from warrior to human. He writes in his book, "What influence these kind-hearted individuals had upon my life cannot be adequately measured or told. I can only say that those human touches had begun to work on me with strange power. If anyone had tried to change me or my mind, I am sure that being in the mental condition I was in, I would have reacted with extreme skepticism. In fact, I would have rigidly closed my mind. But they used no verbal propaganda. They did not try to tell me I was wrong, or even that Japan was wrong. They only wanted me to know and feel that in their minds I was human." So at Camp Livingston, the internees operated on another internment university and had classes in many subjects. Sakamaki took advantage of a wide variety of those courses. One day in November of '42, a guard came to tell him that he was being transferred to an area with more Japanese POWs that had recently been captured. There were about 50 prisoners in this group, led by somebody named Commander Nakamuni. Kazuo began helping the new prisoners understand about what they were to expect in the camp from their American camp captors. On January 1st, 1943, 16 of the 50 left for another camp with Nakamuni, leaving Sakamaki as the ranking officer among the remaining 36. This was quite a responsibility, as the new POWs were not as tame as the civilian internees and had shown hostility towards the guards and the camp. Sakamaki called a meeting, laid out rules, organized them into groups, set up a daily schedule, and started evening classes. Based on his classes with the internees, he ended up teaching American geography, American affairs, English, mathematics, Japanese, and Chinese. So here's a prisoner of war who's helping the new prisoners of war understand their new role as prisoners. He also organized sports such as softball, ping pong, basketball, and tennis because he knew that if the men were kept active, they wouldn't have time to react badly to the camp. However, in February of 1943, a new group of 10 arrived along with the 16 that had left. Unfortunately, Commander Nakamuni had suffered a nervous breakdown and was hospitalized. The new officer arrived and Sakamaki turned the camp leadership over to a gentleman named Lieutenant Commander Matsumoto. So now he's sent back to Camp McCoy, where Sakamaki and other POWs were reconnected with Horace Rogers. There he found out that there were Japanese American soldiers that were being trained at that camp for service in Europe. That summer, he learned that his midget submarine was being hauled across the country on a war bonds tour and had come to a town near Camp McCoy. He realized that his submarine was now performing a strange duty. Instead of sinking a warship, it was raising money to fight against Japan. The stranger thing to him was that he didn't take it too hard. He knew then how much he was changing. Based on the new and increasing numbers of Japanese POWs arriving and their poor health condition, it was obvious that the war was going badly for Japan. A Red Cross ship brought green tea and vitamins for the prisoners. While the more recent prisoners were suffering from illness and shame, life in the camp was relatively peaceful. Some said that the organized life in camp was better run than the Japanese army. They began to think of the camp as a spiritual training camp. After the fall of Saipan on July 9, 1944, the camp POW population swelled to over 1,000. On February 4th of 45, 200 additional prisoners arrived from the Marianas, including Lieutenant Commander Narita, who became the ranking officer in the camp. He's then transferred in spring of 1945 to the Kennedy Alien Detention Camp. And Kennedy is spelled correctly here, just with one N. And this is the only picture I could find of the Kennedy Detention Camp. It doesn't look very, friendly or happy. On May 8th, 1945, they all learned of the German surrender. All of them could tell what it appeared that the Allies would end up prevailing in the war. The mood in the camp was somber. Prisoners believed that their capture meant that they had not fought hard enough for the country. The loss of the war was their fault. But Sakamaki vowed that he would work hard to rebuild Japan and that this was the only way he could repay his debt to the country. Sakamaki and 800 former POWs left Kennedy on the long trip homeward, and he arrived back in Japan on January 4th, 1946. This is where Kennedy Detention Camp is, south and east of San Antonio, Texas, about 63 miles. So here's what happened in 1945. We have Hiroshima on August 6th, Nagasaki on August 9th. They signed the surrender on September the 2nd, and he's released on December the 1st. He was 27 years old and had been held as a POW for 4 years, 10 months, and 24 days. So his return was widely known, and he was a reluctant celebrity. He received many letters from people in Japan, sometimes with mixed thoughts. Some were very angry and hurtful, and mostly from men. However, from women, he received many romantic letters with thinly veiled proposals of marriage with biographies and photos. He was welcomed, of course, by his family, friends, and neighbors who had feared that he may have been lost during his imprisonment or capture. So he's back in Japan, and he starts working his family's farm. And while he received many offers of work, he wanted to be careful of what he accepted. he wanted to stay relatively low-key. He didn't want to use his celebrity for any benefit. Japan had been destroyed, the cities were gone, inflation was rampant, people were confused about what they should think or who they should follow. The economy was in shambles. So, while working on his family farm, he noticed the young lady at an adjoining farm that had been, their fathers had been friends with each other. And they had lived in Hiroshima, and her family was killed in the atomic bomb blast. Her name was Sadako. And after a year after his return, he received a letter from an obscure and small auto manufacturing plant. They were concerned that his experiences during the war and his imprisonment might hinder his ability to work without tension. They were also concerned about his potential celebrity and how that might interfere with his work. They didn't want to exploit his fame. And the letter was from Toyota. And at that time, Toyota was spelled T-O-Y-O-D-A. And they changed to T-O-Y-O-T-A because the Japanese letters that are on T-O-Y-O-T-A take 8 strokes. And 8 is a lucky number, or it's a lucky number in Asian philosophy. So to go to his interview, it took him 3 days to travel by train to get to Nagoya from the southern Japan where his family lived. He ended up being hired and moved his new wife, Sadako, to Nagoya to start their new life. He had a job in personnel and had the job of hiring many Japanese for this, including some previous prisoners of war. So he writes 4 years as prisoner of war number 1 in 1948. He basically led a very private life. He refused to speak or write about his experiences. He ended up being promoted to the president of Toyota operations in Brazil. That was quite a heady title for over 10 years. And retired from Toyota in 1987 with 40 years of service. And here's a picture of him standing with his son. I don't have a picture of him with his daughter. And this is, the car he's standing by is called a deluxe 1955 Toyota Crown. Did anybody have that, one of those cars? So what I find kind of strange is in May of 1991, he was invited to return to Texas to a 50-year commemoration of the Pearl Harbor attack. And it was held in Austin, but the submarine had already been moved to Fredericksburg. And so in the Austin Symposium, which lasted a couple of days, they had a bus trip. Anybody who wanted to go and to the Museum of the War and Pacific was allowed to get on this bus, and he went with the other people and was reunited with his sub. There is a picture of him walking along the side of the sub. And we are told that he cried at the nostalgia of what had happened in his life and how he ended up being where he was at that moment 50 years later. So he led a long life. He died on November 29th, 1999, 12 days after his 81st birthday. And that's it.
Take